we heard how we have to start as we mean to go on and to respect each other in the way we speak to each other. So I do want to ask the Leader of the House if he could ask the Attorney General to come to the House to apologise. Calling us a dead Parliament and calling us turkeys is not appropriate language. If the Attorney General so dislikes Parliament, perhaps he should spend more time with his cases and call a by-election. But I know the Leader of the House has also apologised to Dr. David Nicol, and this is just taking up from where we left off prior to the adjournment of the House. Could the Leader apologise here in the House to Dr. David Nicol to say that he was wrong and that what he said was untrue? He also didn't answer my question about the constitutional coup. Mr. Speaker, I thought we'd eradicated foot and mouth. But if the Leader of the House wants some business, let me give him some business. The Financial Services Bill, report stage, date to be announced. Immigration and Social Security withdrawal bill, report stage, date to be announced. Agriculture bill, report stage, date to be announced. Fisheries bill, report stage, date to be announced. Trade bill, it's had its third reading in the House of Lords on Wednesday the 20th of March, and it's in ping pong. Does the government expect to get the bills through before the 31st of October 2019? And could I ask the Leader of the House again, how long does he think the preparations will be needed before the Queen's speech on the 14th of October? When will Parliament be prorogued? I'd be grateful if the Leader of the House could provide time for a debate on the Electoral Commission report, which has estimated that between 8.3 and 9.4 million people in Great Britain who are eligible to be on the local government registers are not correctly registered, and there are between 4.7 and 5.6 million inaccurate entries on these registered. This is the first study since the 2015 assessment of the registered following the transition to individual electoral registration. This is seriously disenfranchising people. My honourable friend, the Shadow Minister for Youth and Voter Engagement, has raised this continuously. Perhaps that's why the government is so keen to have an election while the registers aren't up to date. But I note the Foreign Secretary's statement yesterday on the cases of Nazanin and Mr Ashori raised by honourable members for Hampstead and Kilburn and the honourable member for Lewisham East. Could I ask the Leader of the House if he's had any conversations with the Foreign Secretary? And if the Foreign Secretary has met with Richard Radcliffe or other members of the families of those people, British nationals, who have been incarcerated in Evin prison. These are lost lives. We cannot wait any longer. They're losing times with their family. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Leader of the House for his kind words yesterday on my nomination to the Privy Council. And sitting next to him, I want to congratulate my right honourable friend, the Solicitor General, who's also been elevated to the Privy Council. I know he's very excited about meeting Her Majesty. And we have finally good news from the Whip's office. We want to welcome Evelyn Christine Rose Puddick.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Lady says quite correctly this is no way to run a Parliament, which is why we should have a general election as soon as possible. And if only they would vote for it and would have the courage of their convictions, we would have one. She then complains that the Attorney General has called this a turkey Parliament. I think it's more of a chicken Parliament because it is trying to flap away from the general election that we need and that would clear the air. And yes, we get gesticulation and murmurations coming forth from the benches opposite saying that we are going to get one. But when, Mr. Speaker, when? The country wants one as soon as possible. And this Parliament, I think rather than dead, I would use the word addled, like the Parliament of 1614, which was known as the addled Parliament. This, I think, may also come to be known in such a way. The Right Honourable Lady mentions Dr. Nichols. I'm happy to repeat the apology I gave before. And she referred to a question I answered at some length yesterday on the question of a coup. What I pointed out was that if things are said in Cabinet, the 30-year rule means that they will come out in 30 years. But just because newspapers print gossip from Cabinet meetings does not make it fact. And I fully support and stand by what the Prime Minister has said, which I will read out again for the benefit of honourable and right honourable members, which is, I have the highest respect, of course, for our judiciary and the independence of our courts. But I must say I strongly disagree with this judgment, and we in the UK will not be deterred from getting on and delivering on the will of the people to come out of the EU on October the 31st, because that is what we were mandated to do. So that is my position. She mentioned a number of bills that are blocked. One of the advantages of prorogation, had it taken place, was we could start afresh. Start with new bills, better bills, bigger bills, brilliant bills, and that is what will happen when eventually we get to a Queen's speech. And the Right Honourable Lady asks about the timings for the Queen's speech. I think the best thing for me to tell her is that is being discussed with Black Rod. Very few changes need to be made in this chamber for a Queen's speech, but quite a number of changes need to be made in the House of Lords for the Queen's speech, in addition to the unsightly barriers that are there for security, which of course are removed prior to a Queen's speech and the road closures associated with that. So it's trying to work out simply the timings to ensure that any prorogation meets the requirements of the Supreme Court's judgment. She asks for a debate on the Electoral Commission's report. It is obviously key and in all our interests that electoral registers should be up to date, though some of us also feel it's important that parliamentary constituencies should be up to date, which would be beneficial. And I'm interested to see that some members of the opposition bench are keen on boundary changes, and I note that with great interest. And finally, the Right Honourable Lady asked me about the dual nationals held illegally by Iran and whether I've had any conversations with the Foreign Secretary. Yes, indeed, I asked him about it yesterday, and he has spoken to his Iranian counterpart about all the dual nationals, including, of course, Mrs. Zaghari Ratcliffe, as did the Prime Minister when he saw the President of Iran on the fringes of the meeting in the United Nations. So I hope I can reassure her that the government continues to push, and may I thank her for continuing to push, because repeating things every week actually is powerful. It does keep people on their toes, and I hope she will continue to do that.
Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Far from being a zombie parliament, actually, there are lots of bills that we could consider passing. I'm pleased to hear that the Leader of the House has scheduled a second reading for the domestic abuse bill, but there are other private members' bills, including one I was seeking to bring through the House, that have all-party support. And the credit worthiness assessment bill could help millions of renters get improved credit scores. It's one idea for the government to look at some of these private members' bills, seeing as the House is now sitting unexpectedly, and actually put them through into law.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. It has to be said that this Parliament has passed more private members' bills than any since 2003. 13 have gone to royal assent, and additional Fridays were made available. I think it was absolutely right that additional time was made available, but the essential point of what we are trying to do is to get through the public business that the government was elected to get through. That is what we are aiming for, and we have done well on private members' bills, but I doubt that there will be additional time for them.
Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to echo the calls for the importance of temperate language in our exchanges in the House. I also join the congratulations of the Right Honourable Shadow Leader of the House. I do feel now that my honourable friend for Perth and North Perthshire is going to be left out at these exchanges, and his Privy Councillorship really must be expedited as a matter of urgency. The business, such as it is next week, we're very happy to support all the efforts to restore the operation of devolved government in Northern Ireland. But my heart does bleed for the poor Conservative ministers and backbenchers who will have to come to the House now during their conference. Successive SNP chief whips have used the usual channels to communicate the dates of our conferences over the years, and at no point have we been afforded with a recess, despite our status as the third party in this place. In fact, the target date for the Queen's, or it may not be the target date for the Queen's speech now, is the second day of the SNP conference, and given that none of us have yet mastered the art of bilocation, I would be interested in the Leader of the House's recommendations for those circumstances. But given that the House is to continue meeting, thanks in no small part due to the efforts of my honourable and learned friend from Edinburgh South West, I want to emphasise what my right honourable friend for Perth and North Perthshire said last night. The standing orders of this House provide for 3 opposition days per session in the name of the leader of the third party. And in 2 years, Mr Speaker, we've had 1.5 days. So however long this session runs for before the next legal prorogation, the Leader of the House really needs to find time for us to fulfil our role as the third party in this House, the largest party in Scotland, and as the standing orders of this House, which he considers to be sovereign, require. Knowing how much he cherishes the procedures and customs of this place, I'm sure he's the last person that would want to be in breach of either the spirit or the letter of those standing orders.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I agree with the honourable gentleman. Temperate language is often to be encouraged. And he mentioned bilocation. I think Padre Pio, not that long ago canonised, was famed for his ability to be in 2 places at once, and there's very good evidence for this. I'm surprised the SNP do not consider themselves sufficiently saintly to be able to achieve the same task and be both at their conference and away from it. The most important point that the honourable gentleman raised is about the opposition day for the SNP. Well, I will say on behalf of Her Majesty's Government that they may have an opposition day any day next week. Should they wish to have a vote of confidence, it will be theirs.
Dame Cheryl Gillen.
Mr Speaker, you will know the threat that is posed to our countryside in Buckinghamshire, and particularly at the moment, despite all the rain that is falling, the drought which has caused the problems with our chalk streams. Could the Leader of the House give us an opportunity, now we're back in Parliament, to discuss the excellent report made by Julian Glover and his team into national parks? And in particular, we would be able to debate his recommendation that the Chilterns AONB is a suitable subject to get the protection of national park status.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, anything that my right honourable friend says is likely to be an excellent idea, so I have a great deal of sympathy for her request for a debate, but I'm afraid I will once again throw it over to the Chairman of the Backbench Business Committee, because I think it is entirely suitable for that committee.
Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Mr Speaker. Can I add my congratulations to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Leader of the House, for her elevation to the Privy Council. Can I also thank the Leader of the House for announcing the Backbench Business for next Thursday, 2 debates on women's mental health and on the spending of the Ministry of Justice. Can I also remind the House that the Backbench Business Committee is still accepting applications for debates, and applications can be submitted until 2:30 tomorrow for consideration next week, and that the committee will need to meet as soon as possible next week on our return.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That's an enormously and characteristically, if I may say so, helpful intervention from the Chairman of the Backbench Business Committee, and members will have heard 2:30 tomorrow is the deadline for applications.
Sir John Hayes.
Mr Speaker, we are what we remember. Each of us is comprised by where we've been, who we've known, and what we've done. But when dementia robs people of all of that, they are bewildered and their friends and families fearful. 850,000 people suffer from dementia in this country, Mr Speaker, 63,000 of them under the age of 65. And it won't be lost on you that the 21st of September was World Alzheimer's Day. Research into this is still much less than for other major medical problems. And so I asked the Leader of the House for a debate on this subject which affects so many of our constituents. Hegel said that life has value only when it has something valuable as its object. Let it be our object never to forget those who can no longer remember.
Mr Speaker, I have so much sympathy with what my right honourable friend says, and dementia is something that hits families particularly hard. Sometimes it hits the carers much more than the individual who is suffering from it. And all of us will have known people suffering from dementia, and how hard it is for families as they are forgotten by the person they have been closest to. So I think it is a worthy subject for debate. I'm sorry not to be able to promise it in government time, but I think in adjournment debate time, or indeed backbench business time, it would certainly have my support if I was still a backbencher.
Mr Carmichael.
Speaker, can I take the Leader of the House back to his assertion that the 12 bills that have been started by the government and are still outstanding are somehow blocked by this House? Can I just offer him one example, the Fisheries Bill, which is of tremendous importance to my constituents. What passed this House at second reading without division, as I recall. It was in committee with only one minor amendment made to it. There is a broad measure of cross-party support, but yet it has sat in parliamentary limbo since the end of November last year. If there is a blockage, that blockage surely is within government and not Parliament. Will we get that bill before the government tries to prorogue again?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for making the point. The government is satisfied that all the bills that are needed prior to leaving the European Union on the 31st of October are in place, save for a withdrawal agreement bill should we get an agreement before that, and therefore it is not essential that these bills make further progress. However, I would add that one of the reasons they have not made progress is that they have been, in other cases, amended in such a way as they don't achieve the object of government policy. The chuntering from a central position says fisheries. That does not stop the bill being amended when it comes back either here or in another place. And there is no certainty that these bills will get through without actually doing things that are contrary to government policy. And therefore it is unlikely they will make progress.
Tracy Crouch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was humbled to be asked in January 2018 to become the world's first loneliness minister in order to continue the work at the highest level that our late colleague Jo Cox had championed. On the 15th of October last year, it was my privilege to publish the government's loneliness strategy, the foundation for a decade of work ahead. Does the Leader of the House agree with me that the best way we could talk about Jo's legacy is for there to be an oral statement on the 15th from the government updating the House on progress in implementing the recommendations from the strategy, and on a date as close to the anniversary, a debate in government time on loneliness so we can champion the work of those trying to keep society connected and celebrate those famous words from Jo that even now we still have more that unites us than divides us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that last point is absolutely true. We all have more that unites us than divides us. May I congratulate my honourable friend who has made a real mark in this area, particularly as the world's first loneliness minister. I know the whole House will welcome all that she has done and continues to do so to build upon the legacy of Jo Cox. It is true that people who are lonely are more likely to be readmitted to hospital, visit a GP or accident and emergency, enter local authority residential care, and perform poorly at work. All of this comes at a cost to the individual, to communities, to employers, and to public services. We want to do everything we can to ease those burdens. Tackling loneliness requires society-wide change. We have been working in partnership with businesses to capture and share the work they are doing to help tackle loneliness in the wider community and to encourage employers to tackle loneliness amongst their employees. As regards a debate, it is difficult to promise a particular debate in government time, but if the House is reopened on the 14th of October with a Queen's speech, then of course the Queen's speech is a time to raise any matter that an honourable or right honourable member feels is suitable, and it would be a good occasion to bring these matters to wider attention.
Dakin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Kaylee Moran, was the victim of a serial rapist, Dimitris Aspiotis, when working in Corfu. In 2010, he was sentenced to 52 years in prison. So Kaylee was shocked to learn through the media of his very early release. Can we have a statement from the Foreign Secretary on what discussions have been had with Greece about the very early release of convicted rapists and the impact on the safety of British women abroad?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, this is something that must be taken with enormous seriousness. That 52-year sentence indicates the brutality and horror of what must have happened to the honourable gentleman's constituent, and to be released so soon seems to indicate that the consequences of his action are not being justly imposed upon him. I will, of course, bring this to the attention of the Foreign Secretary and will send a written answer to the honourable gentleman, but I'm very glad he's brought this to the attention of the House.
Indeed. Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Can I join the Shadow Leader of the House in asking for a debate on the Electoral Commission? Is my right honourable friend aware that the Electoral Commission have referred very many people to the police for investigation? Those investigations have got nowhere. This reflects professional people employed by all of the parties and other organisations as well. When a government body is responsible for referring people to the police, they really hadn't ought to do so unless there was very, very good information that there was likely to be a prosecution. And the Electoral Commission on a number of occasions have referred people and there has been no such prosecution.
Thank you. My right honourable friend raises a matter of the greatest seriousness, that the Electoral Commission is publicly funded and has to be held accountable for its actions. To say that somebody is referred to the police is a great blot on their reputation, on their ability to carry out their functions if they are elected to office, because a whiff of suspicion will be around them. And therefore he is quite right to say that any suggestion of a police referral must only be done when there's a very high likelihood of success. I think this is more a matter for the Backbench Business Committee, but it is indeed a serious matter.
Mr. Creasy.
Speaker, may I thank the Leader of the House for illustrating so beautifully why so many of us have fought the concept of Parliament being prorogued and indeed a recess, in setting forward a date for the Domestic Abuse Bill to get its second reading, and thus proving that there is business across the House people want to see move forward, that we could be doing, and work that we could be doing in this place that our constituents would value. Last night, I raised with him the fact that the government has missed an important reporting deadline in its work to tackle abuse against women, in particular a report to the UN on addressing the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Can he tell us when we will see that report from the government? And also, can he tell us when he envisages the committee stage rather, of the domestic abuse bill happening, and if, given the widespread support for this legislation in its current form, he will commit to having that on the floor of the House so that we can all contribute to making this a country where everyone is safe?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I'm so pleased that she is welcoming the government's schedule of business for next week. As I said in this House yesterday, this same bill would have been a major part of the Queen's speech had it come at the Queen's speech instead of next week, and that this bill is something that the government is particularly and singularly committed to. So it is an important bill that is going to be brought forward, showing the government's intent, and I think the speed of its passage will be no faster and no slower coming next week than had it come in the Queen's speech.
A number of colleagues across the House were in Bangladesh last week, many of whom got to see the plight of the Rohingya. The reality is that the government has responded well in providing international aid, but there are 1.3 million displaced people who want to return home. Can we therefore have a debate in government time on what we can do as a country to enable those people to return home to Myanmar in safety and security and bring this to the attention of the world?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The plight of the Rohingya people is one of the great scandals of our time, and that 1.3 million people are displaced is something that the world must be concerned about, and it is one of the areas where our overseas aid budget is most properly used. I'm sure that ministers are aware of this. There are no immediate plans for a debate. I don't want to refer everything to the Backbench Business Committee, but I think it is once again something that falls in the Chairman's lap.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really pleased that we will be having the second reading of the Domestic Abuse Bill next week. However, I know the Leader of the House is a stickler for procedure and doing things correctly. So can he just explain to me, as a mere novice, having only been in the House 14 years, how it is that the government have already announced the statutory role of a domestic abuse commissioner, despite the pre-legislative committee which I served on with the Honourable Lady who serves as the chair of the Select Committee, where we made recommendations about how that post should be a full-time post and not a 2 or 3 day a week post. And we also made recommendations about the budget and staffing requirements. So how is it that that has been allowed to be made, that appointment, when we haven't actually had the second reading of the bill or gone through the committee stage or third reading or the final stages of the bill or it going through the House of Lords?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady has longer experience in the House than I do by a full Parliament, so I bow to her superior knowledge on procedural matters. I would have thought it would be welcome that the government has got on and appointed Nicole Jacobs as the first Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And of course, what goes through into the bill, what is passed by Parliament, will be the law, and that will be the standing of the post of the Commissioner. But this is merely an opportunity to get on with things, to push ahead, and I would have thought it would be welcome.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we have a debate on minimum unit pricing? Ministers, when this was introduced in Scotland, said that they would, that in England they would await the outcome of that implementation. And there's been a report today that implementation in Scotland is benefiting those who are drinking at risk of their health. Can we have a debate on this? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everything the Honourable Lady says I take with the greatest seriousness. She is a most wonderful campaigner and aims to make the lives of people in this country better by everything that she does, and I particularly admire her support for the family. I think the issue she raises is a crucial one, but is much more, once again, a matter for the Backbench Business Committee.
Anna Soubry.
Could the Leader of the House tell us, please, which ministers will be taking questions on which days, and are the ballots open so that we can submit our questions? And given that the Queen's speech apparently is going to be held on the 14th of October, could he tell us, please, when Parliament will be prorogued for that occasion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I understand, the Chancellor will be taking questions on Tuesday. It is normal for a 3-day rota to be set. It will be Monday, but it will be available in the table office, and the Prime Minister will be, I assume, making his normal appearance on Wednesday. But the table office is the right place to go for those questions.
Well, it's a question of a medical doctor or a doctor of philosophy. I think on this occasion I'll take the medical doctor, Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr.
Doctor! He's a very distinguished fellow, but he's not a doctor. We'll come to the fellow in due course. Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know how much my right honourable friend works hard for his constituents, but perhaps one constituent in particular he has worked especially hard for, and that is his constituent Max. Max, who has Batten's disease and was needing Brineura, an important drug for this rare and very, very unpleasant condition, which ultimately would lead to his death without this work. He had an urgent question on the topic before the recess in the summer, and just before the prorogation ceremony, just after the prorogation ceremony, we heard from NHS England that this drug will now be available. Does my right honourable friend feel that a debate on how the rare diseases protocols are done would be beneficial to ensure that other people do not have to wait so long as Max has?
Can I just say to colleagues, perhaps I should have explained, and I will now do so, the next debate, if it's to have 2 hours, needs to start at 3 o'clock. If people insist on making long interventions, they're stopping others. They must know they're stopping others. It's as simple and incontrovertible as that. The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful for that question. The issue with Max, who has Batten disease, is one of the greatest difficulty, and I'm so pleased that the drug is now being made available. But I agree with my honourable friend that there is a need for greater debate and discussion on the availability of medicines for rare diseases. Again, I think it's backbench business matter, but it is something the government is taking seriously, and I'm grateful to NHS England that they have found the funding so that Max will get the drug he so needs.
Stephen Doughty.
On incineration of waste. Many constituents in my constituency in St Mellons and Rumney are very concerned about the locating of a new waste incinerator, but also the emissions from vehicles, big HGVs going to that plant. I'm sure the Leader of the House would agree that's an issue on which would be interest across the House.
Mr. Speaker, I think that's ideal for an adjournment debate, and I believe you're open to applications.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
Speaker, our parliamentary democracy has taken a battering in the last few years. So can I ask the Leader of the House if he would bring forward legislation in the Queen's speech to ensure the recommendations of the boundary review are implemented and we all represent our constituents of an equal proportion and size?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the principle that constituencies should have the same number of electors in them is a very good and important one. I do make an exception for the honourable gentleman for Nihilling and Anyar, which for particular geographical reasons has slightly fewer constituents, but may I say the constituents there are some of the finest people in this country, so I wouldn't quite say they count double, but they are heading in that direction. Actually, when the matter was being debated some years ago, I thought it should be created a rotten borough for the honourable gentleman because he brings so much levity and pleasure to this House through his interjections. However, my opinion...
Often deliberately.
So I'm very sympathetic to what my honourable friend says. The statutory instrument is prepared but is being considered and will be brought forward if there is a suitable opportunity.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
God bless you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Can I add my voice to the honourable member for Putney, the right honourable member for Putney, and make a plea for the child refugee family reunion bill amongst the private members' bill that should see some progress here. And can I also say, Mr. Speaker, that we're seeing a chamber today that's actually a model of civility. All afternoon is back to what Parliament was compared to last night. And can I maybe add a suggestion to improve and to get rid of the toxicity and the disorder we saw last night? That Acts of Parliament get referred by their proper names as being assented to by the Queen. And we don't give them monikers or pejorative titles. They're just called, and I'm sure the Leader of the House, if one of those sticklers, would like this to happen, not tabloid monikers, and perhaps the Speaker might indeed rule it disorderly, because this was the act that was stoking the fires of toxicity and disorder last night.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stickler though I am, I think... What?
I can't believe the honourable gentleman, the member for Hendon, has forgotten the fact of his pearls of wisdom so soon after he uttered them. Maybe he's got a second set of pearls in mind, I don't know. But it may have to wait. I do beg the Leader's pardon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's perfectly reasonable to refer to bills by colloquial names. That is traditional and perfectly reasonable thing to do. And of course, it is a political matter, and that people will use the names that they use. And the forms on language in this House are well set out. And as Mr. Speaker said earlier, nothing disorderly happened yesterday. And I think we have to be really careful. Civility is important. Being polite to each other is important. When we see that members on either side are vilified or threats to their safety are made, we must oppose them vigorously. But that is such a different order of magnitude from robust debate in this House. And to conflate the two is a fundamental error and risks making the serious nature of what is happening to some members appear to be part of back-and-forth politicisation. It is not. It is really serious, but the surrender bill term is one that is a matter of taste and not a matter of any real importance, and I'm quite happy with the term surrender bill.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry I'm not a doctor, but I am at least a patient and patient.
The leader mentioned many SIs, but he didn't make any mention of the Civil Partnership Marriages and Deaths Registration etc. Now Act, which received royal assent in May, and which requires an SI by the beginning of December in order for opposite-sex couples to enter into a civil partnership by the 31st of December, and many bookings have provisionally been made. So can he update the House to guarantee that that SI will go through in good time, because many happy couples are expecting it?
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for my right honourable friend, I'm so sorry, for raising. You can't. A gentleman of his seniority, I do apologise. Anyway, the point he makes is an important one. I will take it up with the relevant Secretary of State to see when that statutory instrument is planned. David Hanson.
As we approach the end of this session, could I just look at one particular issue, which is government consultations? The Home Office issued a consultation on air rifle safety in October 2017, which closed in February 2018. We still not have had the government response to that consultation. That's simply not acceptable. Could the Leader of the House look at that consultation period?
It's being considered very carefully.
The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who I've advised I was going to mention in the Chamber, said in the Chamber on Wednesday the automotive sector, who I met this week, confirmed that they were ready. The retail sector said they were ready. Representatives of that industry who were at the meeting, however, denied this was the case, saying, amongst many other things, that the claims made in here did not bear reality. Similar concerns have been raised by other industries and sectors. Given the comments were made in this Chamber by the Minister who is responsible for the UK's Brexit planning, and they appear to bear little relationship to the situation on the ground, would the government do the Parliament the courtesy of scheduling a full debate on this issue to get to the bottom of things and give the right honourable gentleman a chance to provide much-needed clarity on just what exactly we'll be facing in a few weeks' time?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure what the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said is entirely accurate. You can always find some Ramona to disagree.
Mr. Speaker, yet another ATM in Blantyre, my constituency, turned fee charging in the last few days. If the Speaker of the House wants to strike some consensus in the next few weeks, can we have a debate in government time about access to cash?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think all of us always want access to cash, and I think it's very important, particularly in rural communities, that access to cash should remain possible. Many people want to carry on using traditional forms of payment. So I think what he is calling for is not unreasonable, but I'm afraid I am once again going to refer him to the Chairman of the Backbench Business Committee. But he was listening closely earlier. Until 2:30 tomorrow, applications are still being received.
The fact that the Leader of the House announced more than a dozen pieces of business himself disproves the nonsense that we could have a luxurious 5-week prorogation. There's tons of business that needs to be attended to, including the lack of progress on the trade bill. We have a dysfunctional arrangement for scrutinising the trade arrangements with the United States, for example. Those arrangements are continuing. It's totally unacceptable. When will we get a chance to scrutinise these things according to law?
The trade bill has a bit on a customs union in it, which would be an absolute disaster. It won't come back in that form.
After being admitted to hospital 28 times in 3 years for acute respiratory problems because she lived 25 metres from a road in South London that exceeded legal pollution limits. When will he find time to debate a clean air bill or bring forward the environment bill to include those provisions so 62,000 people don't die prematurely a year?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising that very sad case. It is obviously important that we have clean air, and the government has an ambitious policy to improve the quality of air in this country, and that is being pushed forward with.
Dr. Rupert Hark.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for your words last night, acknowledging that it's ethnic minority women that often bear the brunt of words by members of this House, not only in here, but columns denigrating women as letterboxers and bank robbers. I wanted to put to the Leader of the House, however, this point made by Matt from Ealing to me. He says he's watching with despair. I think, like me, it was quite late. We don't all have nanny to do our childcare. I was watching from home last night very late. He says there's a continual refusal on the part of the Prime Minister to answer any of the questions put to him. Is it not within the remit for them to answer the questions put to them? Does he not agree with me that if the quality of the exchanges was better, there'd be more respect outside for us and we'd be able to do our jobs better?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do share the honourable lady's concern with the quality of exchanges and the embarrassment of the benches opposite, who saw their leader having his Neil Kinnock moment yesterday.
Tim Farron.
In the House, make time for my now de-prorogued bill on access to radiotherapy treatment, because it is wrong, surely, that people, cancer sufferers, should have to travel day after day, week after week, for 3-hour round trips for cancer treatment. Wouldn't it be right to place satellite units in places like Kendal so we can have longer lives, shorter journeys?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The general point on private members' bills is that if we get to a new session, there will be more Fridays, there will be a new ballot, and there will be the opportunity for members to bring forward their bills. That would be the best way to go about it.
Chris Bryant.
Wouldn't it improve the atmosphere in all of our debates in the House if we returned to an older tradition and took a self-denying ordinance and all of us refused to clap?
Yes, yes, and yes.
David Linden.
Mr. Speaker, by his own admission, the Leader of the House is not very familiar with nappies or how they work, but I'm sure he's very familiar with my Nappies Environmental Standards Bill. So will they agree to meet with me to look at when we can get a second reading for this bill, and might even be able to bring in a reusable nappy from hotspots in Queensland?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I have a general rule which I'm happy to tell the House. As Leader of the House, I will meet any member who wants to see me to discuss nappies or any other subject that comes to mind. I think it is important that honourable and right honourable members have access to people, and I know, Mr. Speaker, you do the same.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I can start by asking the Leader of the House to pass on my congratulations to his niece, who I gather was selected for Stafford last night. Slightly disappointed she's not standing against me again, given the 2017 result, though. But on a more serious note, we both raised at Prime Minister's questions before the summer recess the case of Jake Ogmore, my constituent, and access to the drug Spinraza. It's been raised a number of times in various different forums in this House. What does the Leader of the House think that we can do to try to make sure that Jake's case is raised again?
Thank you, and may I thank the honourable lady for her characteristically generous words. That's very much appreciated, and it is kind of her as my neighbour in Somerset, and I will certainly pass that on to Theodora. I am now bound by collective responsibility, but my views on Spinraza have not changed since I became Leader of the House. She has quite rightly raised this issue, but I will write to the Secretary of State for Health making the point that she has made.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, can I draw the Leader of the House's attention to early day motion 2719, celebrating the football career and life of Fernando Rickson, the former captain of Rangers Football Club, who died last week as a result of a long battle against motor neuron disease. So can I ask the Leader of the House if we can have a statement or a debate on how the state can support those with this illness?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I understand a foundation has been set up in honour of Mr. Rickson to raise funds to help people and to have further research into these diseases. I think he's absolutely right that motor neurone disease is a particularly horrible illness and one that the Health Service will need to look at with importance, and I will pass on his comments to the Secretary of State.
Kevin Brennan.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Leader for agreeing to meet all members? I always found if any minister refuses to meet a member, a diet of 10 written parliamentary questions a day until further notice soon does the trick, and that's just a tip for newer members. But on the issue of prorogation, I understand why he said he can't give us the date because of his consultations with Blackroyd about the arrangements for the state opening. But can he at least confirm, which I'm sure he can for the benefit of the House, that the government does not intend to prorogue next week?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the point on written questions, I think I put over 300 written questions down on the European arrest warrant. It didn't necessarily get me what I wanted, but it certainly kept somebody busy. Prorogation will meet the judgment of the court, and therefore will be the time necessary to move to a Queen's speech and no more.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the House has already dinghied my request to have my supervised drug consumption bill heard in the House, but could he perhaps instead, an alternative strategy, speak to ministers in the Home Office to ask if a statutory instrument could be laid to create an exemption to the Misuse of Drugs Act to allow Glasgow to get on with the job of saving lives?
Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity for issues exactly like that to be raised, and I will always pass on members' comments and requests for statutory instruments to the relevant Secretary of State. Of course I will do that.
Today's urgent question on the arms trade to Saudi Arabia indicates that there is a bigger issue here. Will the government schedule a longer debate in government time, and will the Leader of the House in particular consider turning the Committees for Arms Controls into a standalone committee, which is in his gift?
Leader of the House. Mr. Speaker, very few things are within my gift that specifically. I think it's in other people's gift as well. The issue was raised. There was an urgent question. The honourable gentleman knows how to ask for Standing Order 24 debates or to go to the Backbench Business Committee, but the government has announced its schedule of business for next week.
Graham P. Jones.
Can we have a debate on the strategic road network in the North West, particularly the M65 extension through to the M1, and perhaps he could advise me how best to pursue this, either through his good office or the office of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm getting slightly repetitive at this stage, but I think the best opportunity for that would be during the Queen's speech once we've got a new session of Parliament and when there is time, days of debate, where members can raise with a minister present really serious and important issues, particularly ones relating to infrastructure. So I hope that he will do that.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The collapse of Thomas Cook has deprived around 300 people based in my constituency of their livelihoods. And I've been contacted by a Thomas Cook employee suggesting that the Transport Secretary, some of the figures used by the Transport Secretary were incorrect. And moreover, that tens of millions of pounds was stripped from the business just hours before it became insolvent. Can we have a debate on this very important issue, please?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very sorry to hear of the job losses in the honourable gentleman's constituency. It is always a blow to the individuals concerned when businesses fail. It seems to me that really serious questions have been raised about the way money was taken out of Thomas Cook, the payments that were made, and other more senior ministers than I have made these points as well. I unquestionably believe in free markets, but free markets require people to behave properly and to view the companies that they are running as a trust rather than something which can simply be stripped of its assets and run dry. So I think there is a very good argument for what he is saying, and I hope he will have his application in by 2:30 tomorrow to the Chairman of the Backbench Business Committee.
Brown. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a constituent whose husband was declined a credit card because their bank classed a car lease as unsecured debt, when clearly that's actually secured debt. Yet she herself was able to get a credit card from the same bank, which is illogical. As the Ombudsman says, banks can set rules as they see fit. My constituent would like a government statement on how we can set more competent credit assessment rules for banks that they can be held to account on.
Mr. Speaker, I think that really is a matter for the Government of the Bank of England, but it may be worth taking up with the about-to-be-elected Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, who may be able to call him in to ask him about the important questions of credit control by banks.
And that election will take place in the course of October, as I suspect the honourable gentleman will know. Yes, I will come to points of order now. Point of order, Liz Saville-Roberts.
The Supreme Court told us with great clarity this week that accountability lies at the heart of parliamentary democracy. I would seek to know what resorts do we have when the Prime Minister respects no boundaries in his tactics, language and conduct, and that in order to avoid or deflect accountability. Could he advise me, therefore, on the applicability of either an impeachment motion or, alternatively, censure by the House relating to the conduct of the Prime Minister?
Honourable Lady, for her point of order and for her characteristic courtesy in giving me advance notice of her intention to raise it, what I would say to the Right Honourable Lady at this stage is that there are various ways in which honourable and right honourable members can seek to debate the conduct of ministers and indeed of others. on the floor of the House. My suggestion to her is that she should visit the table office where the clerks will be ready to advise her in more detail on the options which are open to her. Point of order, Dr. Matthew Offord.
Mr. Speaker, back in March I was invited by the Suffolk North West London Food Bank to visit and understand the work they are taking part in on behalf of my constituents. I followed the parliamentary protocol of informing the member for Brent Central that I would be visiting Suffolk as it is in her constituency. So it came as quite a surprise that the Brent Central Labour Party and Brent Momentum tweeted an identical picture of 6 men saying that they heard I was planning a photo op and were going to go along to make their feelings known. Now, neither my office or Suffolk advised anyone of the meeting, and I'm not going to impugn the reputation of another member, but can you advise me, please, if any member or indeed the staff in their parliamentary office is responsible for leaking the information about the whereabouts or location of a member, what action will the House take against them?
I hope the Honourable Gentleman will forgive me, but even if he doesn't, I cannot possibly be expected to know the circumstances which the Honourable Gentleman has just described. That's the first point. Secondly, although he has kindly told the House that he informed the Honourable Lady of his intention to raise the matter, I have not heard her viewpoint on it. Manifestly, it cannot be here now at 3:01 on Thursday afternoon a matter for adjudication by the Chair. I should have thought that that was readily apparent. So the Honourable Gentleman has made his point and registered his displeasure, and I'm sorry if he has felt ill-served by the way in which he has been treated or the reaction to his visit. But palpably, it's not a matter for me now. And we do have other business which is quite heavily subscribed, which the Honourable Gentleman might concede is perhaps more pressing. Point of order, Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, you often give advice to members of this House that they should persist, persist, persist. So I'm going to attempt to persist. I wrote to the Prime Minister 7 weeks ago seeking a reply on the basis of the need for compensation to be paid to those who had been affected by the contaminated blood scandal on the basis that one victim was dying every 4 days. I then asked the Leader of the House 3 weeks ago if he would assist me in getting at least the courtesy of a reply. I sent my letters to the Leader. Since then, I've heard nothing. I've not had the courtesy of a reply, and I just wondered, Mr. Speaker, what your view is about a Member of Parliament writing to the Prime Minister with the whole range of the civil service that he has at his disposal and not being able to provide at least an acknowledgement of a letter.
Well, frankly, I'm astonished by that. I'm astonished by that. There is a very long established convention in this place that questions to ministers are answered in a timely and preferably a substantive fashion, of which the corollary, and I say this as much for the benefit of those who want our proceedings to be intelligible as to members of the House who may know already, is that letters that are sent to ministers should be timeously answered. And the Leader of the House, at any given time, has always accepted a responsibility to chase progress on these matters. And I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman will forgive me if I say that the role of Leader of the House could have almost have been invented for the benefit of the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for North East Somerset. And I know that he will take his responsibility in this matter extremely seriously. And I hope that he will chase a reply. What I also say to the Honourable Lady, as I happen to be very familiar with the issue, though the principle applies whatever the issue, but as I happen to be very familiar with the issue, and I've granted several urgent questions to the Honourable Lady over the years, as she's been an indefatigable campaigner on this matter, is that whether she gets a reply, substantive or not, satisfactory or not, on this matter, if the Honourable Lady wishes, when we return, to pursue this matter on the floor of the House, she will get the chance to pursue it all right. We come now to the general debate on the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate. We have until 5 o'clock. I've spoken to the Minister, who has undertaken to try to deliver an economical speech, though of course he does have the floor, and it is important that we hear the government's position. The debate is to be opened by the Minister. Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate. Mr. Speaker, this is a government that believes in letting the British people exercise their democratic rights. And as Minister for the Cabinet Office, my responsibilities include the smooth running and safeguarding of our elections and ensuring that every elector has the opportunity to cast their vote. And since we came to office in 2010, we have made significant progress to give more people a say. Through the implementation of the individual electoral registration, we have grown the electoral roll to nearly 47 million people, the biggest that it has ever been. People across the country are now able to go online to ensure that they have the opportunity to cast their vote. We have worked to open up the franchise for homeless people and increase accessibility for those with disabilities. We have committed to introducing voter ID to protect the ballot and to stop those who want to steal other people's identities and votes. I will give way in a moment. Voters deserve to have confidence that our elections are secure and protected from electoral fraud. I give way to the gentleman.
Can you tell me what evidence he has that introducing voter ID reduces the amount of fraud more than it reduces the participation of legitimate voters?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I would recommend that he reads the report of the Electoral Commission into this, and I frankly find it astounding that members opposite should think that we shouldn't have identity for voting. You look at major democracies such as Canada, they're ensconced that people can turn up at our polling stations with no evidence of their identity. Yes, I will. I'll give way to them.
To help him on this point, I can tell him that the very first moment that I get a chance to sit at my desk, I will be asking him to come to the House for an end-of-day adjournment debate, where I will give him evidence from my constituents of just the kind of practice which is going on in my constituency, in their view, which will stand up the requirement to put in the changes which he would advocate, I'm quite sure.
Minister! I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I always welcome his help and support in relation to evidence and look forward to that discussion. I will give way once more. I am conscious of the need to...
I'm extremely grateful to the Minister because the honourable gentleman said, will you take it to the police? I'm happy to tell the House today that my agent and I, in the 2015 election, told our candidates, because there was a district council election at the same time as mine, that if there was any evidence of malfeasance, we would be the first to take them to the police. And I found myself, therefore, knocking on the door of the police station with the Liberal Democrat candidate and my agent to report somebody who was subsequently arrested. And unfortunately, he was not prosecuted, and he was one of mine. And I will not have any abuse of the electoral system. And though I understand the honourable gentleman's concerns, I have to tell him we've got to sort this mess out.
Minister. Well, I thank my honourable for that intervention. There really is nothing further that I can add to that, but I did notice that the member for East Antrim was seeking my eye.
Thank the Minister for giving way. Is he aware that in Northern Ireland the increase in proxy votes and postal votes, to which the Electoral Commission has turned a blind eye, and which is done on an industrial scale by Sinn Féin, who look at the marked register, find who hasn't voted in the last election, visit them, get the forms filled in, and as a result, at least 2 members of the SDLP probably lost their seats to electoral fraud in the last election. Will he take that matter up with the Electoral Commission, who seem to have no desire to address that issue?
Minister. I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. Clearly, the Electoral Commission for Northern Ireland is independent, but he has made his point very clearly. If members will forgive me, I will make a little further progress, and then I will give way to the honourable gentleman opposite. So we are working to reduce intimidation around the ballot box and of those in public life, and I'm sure the whole House will agree with me that the latter is a deeply worrying trend that we must reverse. And indeed, earlier this year, the government legislated to prevent candidates in local elections from having to declare their addresses on the ballot paper. We've consulted on and committed to a new electoral offence to stop people from intimidating candidates and campaigners. But, Mr. Speaker, and this really is the essence of this debate, more important than the preparations for an election are the consequences of those elections. And one seismic democratic event has dominated our proceedings since I was elected to this House in 2015. And that, of course, was our referendum on the membership of the European Union. That is something that we promised in the manifesto on which I was elected to this House in 2015, and I well recall the deep scepticism from voters that we would ever deliver on it. And frankly, I don't blame voters. Other parties have been promising referendums for years. Labour in 2005, the Liberal Democrats in 2008, the Greens in 2010. In fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, one way or another, every major political party in Britain fought an election between 2005 and 2015 with a pledge to hold a referendum on our relationship with Europe. But, Mr. Speaker, yes, I will give way to the...
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Earlier on, you was talking about how the government's been extending the franchise, but in terms of consequences of the now EU referendum, one issue with the franchise was that the UK government did not think EU citizens were worthy of the vote. Yeah. In Scotland, in 2014 independence referendum, we did give EU citizens a vote because we recognise the value and contribution. What do you think the contributions? What do you think the consequences? And what message does that send out? Not giving these EU citizens a vote.
Minister.
Well, as the honourable gentleman well knows, the parliamentary franchise that was applied to the referendum is the same parliamentary franchise that applies in other elections. There wasn't the case for changing it. But, Mr. Speaker, what we...
Grateful to my honourable friend giving way. He's been very, very generous indeed. And it's great that we're celebrating the extension of the franchise, more people voting in all elections. But doesn't my friend agree with me that it's very concerning? Because for our democracy to work well, citizens need to have impartial information. They need to be well informed to make informed choices. And websites like 38 Degrees are not providing that information in an impartial way about the work of MPs. So would he agree to work with Hansard, who do such an excellent job, so that our constituents do understand we can demystify the work of MPs in this place, so that they can make informed decisions when they come to the ballot box?
Well, I thank my honourable friend and the member for Truro and Falmouth for that intervention. And she makes an excellent suggestion. I'm sitting next to the Minister for the Constitution. Clearly, we'd have to proceed on an all-party basis, but I'd be very happy for us to take that suggestion further. I will take a couple more interventions, and I really must make some progress. I give way to the honourable.
I'm grateful to the honourable member, and he's absolutely right that all the political parties at one time or another have given a commitment to referendum. In fact, in 2010 manifestos, the three major parties gave a commitment to hold a referendum on what became the Lisbon Treaty, then known as the European Constitution. Unfortunately, a majority of MPs didn't comply with those manifesto commitments. But does he agree with me that those parties who support a referendum, either in here or in their manifestos, should accept the result when they lose?
Minister. The honourable gentleman makes an excellent point, and as I was about to come on to in my remarks, I supported Remain in that referendum campaign, but I was completely clear from the early hours of the morning when we received the result. The job of me as a Member of Parliament and of this government was to deliver on that result, and that's exactly what we should be doing. I committed to give way to the Honourable.
Very grateful to the Honourable gentleman for giving way. Just back to the subject of EU citizens. When I'm out campaigning on the streets of Edinburgh South West in a British general election, EU citizens often come up to me and ask why they're allowed to vote in a Scottish parliamentary election but not a British general election. Now, given the EU citizens make a net contribution to the British economy, what possible justification is there for not allowing them to vote for the government of the whole of the UK rather than just the government of Scotland?
Minister.
Well, it is generally the case that there are not reciprocal voting rights, and our position aligns with virtually every other European state in that. So I don't think we are outriders in the way that the honourable lady suggests. But people were surprised that we actually delivered on that referendum, and when the referendum came, we weren't the only ones to support holding that referendum, in the lobby we won by 544 votes to 53 to give the people a say. 10 to 1. 7, indeed, out of the 8 Liberal Democrat MPs voted for it. Quite a strong showing, really, Mr Deputy Speaker, for a party that now says that the outcome of that referendum doesn't count. And after we voted for the referendum, we went to the public and we made our case. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, did any of us make the argument then, which is now being advanced by some, that this referendum was merely advisory? No, we were absolutely clear that this was in or out, it was remain or leave, every vote was equal, every vote would count, and whatever the outcome, we would respect it. No caveats, no small prints. And as I said to the honourable gentleman opposite, I supported Remain in that campaign, but do you know what? I accepted immediately that we lost. The British people took a different view, and that was their right. So from the moment that result was declared, I accepted it, because there is one thing that I believe passionately, it is that politicians do not get to choose which votes they choose to respect. And when you ask the public for an answer and they give you one, you should simply get on, or one should simply get on and deliver it, even if it wasn't the result that was desired. And the House seemed overwhelmingly to accept this, and it invoked Article 50 with very little dissent. And immediately afterwards, we had an election in which over 80% of people voted for parties that explicitly supported the United Kingdom leaving the EU in their manifesto. A second democratic event relating to our membership of the European Union, and a second mandate from the British people to leave the European Union. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way, but the Labour Party manifesto, for which many millions of people did vote, explicitly said that we would respect the outcome of the referendum, but work against a no-deal Brexit. Absolutely.
Well, I say to the honourable opposite, a deal was put forward by the last Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. I voted for that deal 3 times. I don't seem to remember the honourable gentleman was in the lobby with me. But I must say, since the moment when we had that unity in the outcome of the general election campaign, parliamentarians have got stuck. We have talked endlessly about this. There have been hours of debates, motions, votes, committees, and extraordinary parliamentary manoeuvres on all sides. 3 whole years have ticked by, and whilst we've been double-checking the finer points in Erskine May, the public has been wondering what on earth we have been doing in this place. Mr Deputy Speaker, yes, of course I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Will he, talking about the spirit of unity, will he join me in congratulating 11 members of Her Majesty's major opposition for attending? Because having forced us back, having demanded that the prorogation shouldn't actually happen, they've all gone home.
The honourable raises a very important point. I remember the cries of outrage at the prorogation, the demands that Parliament must return because it had so much to discuss. Honourable members opposite were desperate to discuss it, and yet it comes to mid-afternoon on a Thursday, 2 days in, and how many people do we have opposite? I think I can count them on one hand. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, none of us came into Parliament to avoid making decisions, to duck the issues, or to indulge ourselves in parliamentary processes. But to the outside world, this appears to be exactly what the House is doing. I give way to the honourable.
If, as the honourable gentleman says, we were not elected to avoid making decisions, why did he seek to support a prorogation when we still had 12 bills outstanding?
We in this House could spend forever rehashing the political and legal arguments relating to prorogation. We in the government have accepted, although we disagreed with the outcome of the Supreme Court, and that has put an end to the matter. I don't think it will serve this House to discuss it any further. This is why we are back in this place. But to the outside world, all this House appears to do is to say no. No to a second referendum, no to the single market, no to a customs union, I will give way in a moment, No, no, and as I said, no again to a deal. And perhaps most bizarrely of all, Her Majesty's opposition urges no to a no-confidence motion. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is clear that we have reached an impasse. This Parliament is becoming more entrenched and less effective by the day. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Just keep reading. He will know that actually the closest this House came to saying yes to something was during the time we were having indicative votes. They took place over approximately 4 sitting days of the House and managed to get closer to an agreement than the previous Prime Minister had in around 2 years, ignoring this House when it said it did not support her withdrawal agreement. So is one option for him to have a government that again explores across the House what can find a consensus, and if that consensus was around a deal, but a deal put back to the people in a referendum, would he accept the yes of this House to that step forward?
Minister. Well, I know that the Right Honourable Lady is a passionate campaigner for a second referendum, but I do have to say that the only amendment that I seem to recall that did pass was the Brady Amendment, which sought to remove the backstop, which is precisely the position that the Prime Minister is pursuing in his negotiations. And I think that is a sensible way for the I will make a little more okay, I'll give way one more time.
It is important because we're back here because Britain is in a crisis. We have not prorogued and had recess because Britain is in a crisis. I'm simply asking the Minister an important question. If this House agreed to pass the Prime Minister's deal, but subject to a referendum, would this government accept that?
No, it is not the position of this government to support a second referendum for the simple reason that I honestly do not believe that a second referendum would solve anything, because all the proponents of a second referendum, I've yet to hear people who supported Leave proposing a second referendum. All the proponents of a second referendum are those people. I'm answering the Right Honourable Lady's point, if you'll allow me the opportunity. The only proponents I seem to hear of a second referendum are those who wish to reverse it by voting Remain. If we are then in a situation where we have one vote voting for Leave in a referendum, one for Remain in a referendum, how does that in any way solve the situation? Surely a better way to solve the situation is to agree that deal, this House to pass that deal, and for the country to move on, which it so desperately wishes to do. I give way to the Honourable.
And would you accept that there are even some of those who are calling for a second referendum who have made it quite clear that had that second referendum given a result which they didn't like, they wouldn't have accepted it anyway?
We're going to have a chat.
The Honourable is absolutely right. And indeed, I should also say to the House, and I'm about to come on to this, but the government has offered yet another electoral event to try and solve this. We on this side of the House have been absolutely clear we would wish to have a general election so we could go back to the public a third time. But I must say, I don't suspect that in the end the result would be any different. People wish us to get on with this. And indeed, the consequences ignoring the principle of the right of the electorate to have their decisions implemented, the consequences of that failure to implement really are only too real. People are losing faith. A recent poll found that 77% of people say their trust in MPs across the political spectrum has fallen since the Brexit vote. Another that opinions about our governing system are now at their lowest for 15 years, lower even than during the expenses scandal. Now, I'm sure all honourable members would agree we do not want to see that continue. For what are we here as MPs for? We are here to represent the people. We're not here for ourselves. We are here for the people that elected us, the people that we serve, to vote, to decide and to deliver. And when we can't do that, we must surely accept that the right and proper thing to do is to submit ourselves again to the electorate. We go back to our constituents and ask the electorate for the chance to serve them again or let them choose someone else. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will in a moment. That is the way our Parliament is supposed to work when it faces gridlock, to refresh itself through a general election. That's why, Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has twice offered the opportunity to have that general election. But now we are faced with the most extraordinary no of all. No from the Leader of the Opposition twice to calling that general election. And Mr. Speaker, this is despite... I will give way to the right honourable my right honourable friend, and then I must make progress.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, because it is also important to make the point that had the House voted when the Prime Minister put forward the chance of an election, that election would have taken place before the European Council. And it would have been possible at that European Council for the Prime Minister, whether it be the Leader of the Opposition or the present Prime Minister, to have actually changed and got the deal that they wanted to get. Why does he think the opposition was so afraid of having that opportunity to be in government and attending that council?
I think my right honourable friend answers his own question. It is only too clear. There is only one reason that they do not wish to have that election. That is that they do not believe that they will win it, and they wish to keep this Parliament kept in a state of suspended animation till they think they may have the chance to win that general election. And indeed, even as they continue to frustrate that general election, leaflets are dropping through voters' doors demanding an election from the party opposite. It really is, Mr. Speaker, quite an extraordinary state of affairs. And this is from a Leader of the Opposition, a man who spent his life going weak at the knees for revolutionaries. He suddenly seems rather scared of this change. Apparently, there's a world to win, nothing to lose but change, but maybe just not right now, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Isn't the truth that the public have had enough of this dither and delay? They are saying enough. We are saying enough. If we cannot have the courage to say what we are for, then let us at least have the courage to ask the electorate what they think of that. Mr. Deputy Speaker, forgive me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the principle of democracy and the rights of the electorate matter. This is something that we on this side of the House have always recognised. I am proud to be in a Conservative party that has time and time again embraced reform to give people their say and represented them effectively. We are the party of Disraeli's Second Reform Act, which helped enfranchise the working classes. The law which gave all women the same rights to vote as men. The first female Member of Parliament to take her seat. And, of course, 2 great female Prime Ministers. Yeah. But in this case, the principle also unlocks something far more practical. Following the instruction which 17.4 million people gave us 3 years ago to leave the EU, they want us to move on. And I am conscious that the Deputy Speaker also wishes me to move on, so I shall wind up my remarks very, very shortly. I can assure the Deputy Speaker.
Slightly. Because obviously we're up against time, and the other parties need to come in, but we've 14 backbench speakers who also want to speak. So I'm just really concerned that we are going to run out of time very quickly. Oliver Dowd.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We want to get on out with our jobs as legislators and move on to the things that people want us to focus on: their hospitals, their schools and the safety of their streets. And that is what this government is determined to do. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I commend this motion to the House.
Yeah. Thank you for your... The question is that the House has considered the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate. Shadow Minister Cat Smith.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I do regret that we're having yet another general debate and not making progress with all the outstanding legislation today. After all, isn't it an important principle of democracy and the expectation of our electorate that send us here that we do make progress on passing legislation? But, Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the topic of debate and the principles of democracy are vitally important, and I do welcome the topic for our debate this afternoon, and I also welcome the Minister back to the front bench following the birth of her daughter, the member from Norwich North. In the current political climate, we as elected members of this House must demonstrate our commitment to uphold the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my opening remarks, I want to remind the House that we would all do well to remember to conduct this debate in a civil manner and remember that words matter. I'm sure members of this House will all agree that yesterday was not a good day for this House. Let us acknowledge now that there is a language coming from 2 sides which are throwing petrol on the toxic nature of debate in our country. It is as wrong to call someone a fascist simply for having voted Leave as it is to call someone a traitor simply for having voted Remain. It is as... I will give way once, but due to the remarks of the Deputy Speaker earlier, I'll just give way the once.
Can I thank my honourable friend? It was the word fascist that got me. I've just had a message from one of our female colleagues whose office has been attacked and had to be closed down by the police because of demonstrators shouting fascist at the office. Can I also say on Twitter, addressing journalists in Westminster, a senior government source has warned that abuse of MPs will get worse if they pursue a second referendum. What do they think is going to happen? Is this not language that is causing risk and danger on a daily basis to us all?
I am chilled and shocked by what my honourable friend has just informed the House. And it is reflective of the language that I think we all know is happening out there in communities, but for which we in this House must show some leadership and do better, because it's as inflammatory to call somebody thick for having voted Leave as it is to call somebody a surrenderer for having voted Remain. And none of this toxic language makes the world a better place. It just makes the problems worse, because however this current crisis ends, we do all have to live together, whether we voted Leave, Remain or didn't vote at all. Indeed, and I won't give way again because I'm conscious that the time for this debate and the number of backbench speakers is going to be very tight, but words matter because they have consequences, and I am genuinely concerned that the disgraceful, demeaning and defamatory language that is being used in this House will only whip up more division in our country and in our communities. And I'm drawn to something said by the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, in her final speech as Prime Minister. She said, "Ill words that go unchallenged are the first step on a continuum towards ill deeds, towards a much darker place where hatred and prejudice drive not only what people say, but also what they do." And it seems fitting that these words, which I completely agree with, were said by a Prime Minister that I opposed, because it is so important that we do not lose the ability to disagree with each other without demeaning each other. And in the context of this week's historic Supreme Court ruling, this debate is a timely reminder of why we must respect these crucial principles and rights. It cannot be right that the Prime Minister, who was found by the highest court in our land to have unlawfully shut down our Parliament, suspending democratic accountability and attempting to gag opposition to his reckless plan to crash out of the European Union without a deal. All 11 judges concluded that there was no reason for the Prime Minister to have shut down Parliament and ruled that his actions were unlawful. This attempt to undermine our democracy shows that the Prime Minister is unfit for office and he really should resign immediately. Anything less than resignation will damage the authority of the office of Prime Minister and further undermine public confidence in our political system. And what kind of lesson does this teach our young people? How can we, as elected representatives, expect our constituents to comply with the law when the most senior person in public office acts unlawfully and appears to show no remorse on such an important issue? And as the Shadow Minister for Youth Affairs, I speak with young people up and down the country. And there is a sense of anger shared by many over the criminalisation of their music and the narrative coming from certain parts of the media that drill music is behind the tragic surge in violence. Yet how are we as politicians in any position to accuse drill artists of glorifying violence when politicians themselves are not held responsible for the violent language they use and the impact it has on the culture and climate of debate? And during this debate, the government said they wanted to have a general election. This is something that we can all agree on, and we on the opposition side would like an election at the earliest possible opportunity. However, we cannot trust this government and this Prime Minister not to use this crisis of their own making to drive our country over a no-deal cliff edge in 5 weeks' time. If the government wants an election, they should get an extension and then we will have an election. And the only way to respect the electorate when the election comes is to offer the public a vote on Brexit, putting control back into the hands of people in a confirmatory referendum with a real choice between a credible leave option or remain. However, I do not believe for one moment that resolving Brexit or getting it done will bring our country back together. Because until we acknowledge that the result of that EU referendum in 2016 was not just about the EU, we can't heal our country. In our heart of hearts, we must surely know that that vote wasn't solely about trading relationships, single markets, or courts of justice. We need to start talking about why people feel so left behind, why there is no sense of hope, or why people don't feel security in their jobs or in their homes. We need to start talking about poverty. We need to start talking about the way in which the government systems treat people like numbers and not like people. We need to start talking about PIP and universal credit and why people are being judged fit for work just days before they die. Because unless we heal this country by addressing these huge inequalities, regional inequalities and class inequalities, it won't matter if Brexit happens or not. It won't matter if it's a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit. It won't matter if Brexit doesn't happen at all, because the real divisions in our communities will still be there. Now, let me be controversial. Brexit is not the biggest issue facing our country. You'd be a lot closer to the real biggest issue if you looked at the reasons why Brexit happened. What this country needs is a government that is serious about ending austerity and providing hope and a decent future for people. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, were we to be having this debate in normal political times, I would have criticised the government for their track record. Their oppressive and mandatory voter ID, unfair constituency boundary changes, the individual electoral registration that has seen up to 9.4 million people not correctly on the electoral roll are just a few of the examples of key policy areas where this government has tried to manipulate our democracy and limit the rights of the electorate over the last decade. However, instead, I'm going to focus on the practical solutions that this House could take, not only to uphold but to enhance our democracy. And one way I believe we could achieve this would be to reform the franchise. For years, opposition parties, and credit to them, some government members too, have called on the government to extend the right to vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. This would open up our democracy to a generation of young people and give them a say on the future of their country and demonstrate that we take their views seriously. Ahead of the most important general election for a generation, I urge the government to consider their position on this. And yesterday, at the Labour Party conference, there was a motion passed furthering our policy to grant voting rights to all UK residents, because people who live here and contribute in our communities deserve a say on the future of this country. So will the government adopt Labour's new policy and massively expand the rights of the electorate? We also need to radically increase voter registration too. The published study by the Electoral Commission today shows that up to 9.4 million people are not registered to vote correctly. This is actually an increase of 1 million voters since the Commission's previous estimate. It's an unprecedented democratic crisis which the government has done nothing to address. In fact, the Prime Minister even tried to fix the election date to make it harder for students to take part. Again, what kind of message does this send our young people who already think that politics is failing them? Instead, all political parties should be using their social media platforms and encouraging their activists on doorsteps to encourage voters to register to vote ahead of the general election. We also need policy reform. The current system of individual electoral registration actively punishes mobile, marginalised and vulnerable voter groups and makes it harder for them to take part in our democratic process. To unlock millions of potential voters, the government should examine the use of government data to automatically place people on the electoral roll. And this would help ensure that every eligible voter can have their say. But we also need to stop big money from running our politics and corrupting our democracy, which is why Labour will ban donations to political parties from anyone who isn't registered to pay tax in the UK. If you don't want to contribute to our public services, you shouldn't be able to influence our democracy. This is what democratic principles look like. So whatever the motives behind today's debate, and the topic of the debate is welcome, our country is at a turning point, and it is a duty on all of us to respect the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate.
Order. There is clearly a lot of pressure on this debate, and after the SNP front bench, I will be imposing a formal time limit of 5 minutes. Before that, I'll turn to the Honourable Member for Wickham, and I'm sure he will respect that 5-minute limit too. Steve Bay.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was very pleased earlier today that the Labour member for Birmingham Yardley acknowledged that there is a common sense of good motive amongst members of Parliament from all sides of the House. I confess that has not always been reflected in the tone of many of the debates which I've attended, which has been a cause of some sorrow to me, because I believe that in this debate on the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate, there is a huge amount of common ground. Of course, we got elected to Parliament to uphold those very rights. I think most of us have a common dream, a dream of a society that is ever more prosperous and free, virtuous, or if not virtuous, at least seeking to become more virtuous, happy, people pursuing their goals and flourishing to the fullest extent, not trapped in poverty. And to the front bench spokesman, I'm talking about the inhumanity of bureaucracy under this government. I have to say to her, please read the reports of the Centre for Social Justice at the time leading up to the 2010 election, because the state is never an instrument of kindness and compassion under any government. It's always rule-bound, it's always inhumane. And one of the things we all must do, which is not the topic of this debate, is to work out how to enable all of the wonderful public servants in all of our public services to be freer to express the compassion which they personally feel for other human beings. And members will find on the record a speech I made some time ago in relation to PIP on just this subject. Now, I believe that democracy is the foundation of that dream. And the foundation of that dream is something which I feel very deeply, and that is the moral, legal and political equality of every person. Every single person, irrespective of their actual merits, should be treated by our systems as morally, legally and politically equal. That's why it's so important. Somebody mentioned boundary changes earlier. My constituency happens to represent about the right number of people, but some are way too large and some are way too small, and that does not reflect political equality. And democracy ought not to be idolised. Goodness knows, in the midst of this political crisis, things have gone wrong. And I refer to the economic crisis many times. I have done many times to say that we are, I believe, in a profound crisis of political economy that goes way beyond the topic of any one particular debate. The fundamental issue at stake, though, is this, that we need to be able to restrain the coercive power of the state peacefully at the ballot box. I'll slightly paraphrase Karl Popper, a very important philosopher. He started off on the left. He was, I believe, a Marxist who fled from Marxism when one of his friends was killed in a riot, and people organising it had no sympathy, said that you had to break some eggs to make an omelette. And he started thinking about whether communism was in fact scientific. But he said this, and I do slightly paraphrase to reflect the spirit of the day: you can choose whatever name you like for the two types of government. I personally call the type of government which can be removed peacefully at the ballot box democracy, and the other tyranny. And that is the fundamental point. The public must be able to withdraw their consent from a system of government and have it removed and replaced with a system which they prefer. That's why we need a general election today, because clearly this House has withdrawn its consent from today's government. The government should therefore fall, and we should have a general election. It is unconstitutional. He grumbles from sedentary position. I can't hear him, but I'll take his intervention.
The point is surely that what you get with a general election is a change of government. He's talking about a system of government, which is a quite different thing.
I'm talking about both. I'm talking about the principle of democracy, which is the stability which comes from both a government and a system enjoying democratic legitimacy expressed through the ballot box. Because the second point I want to make is the point about the European Union. I am here today, though I care about many things, because of the way the European Union Constitution was handled. It was put to referenda in Lithuania, Hungary, Slovenia, Italy, Spain, Austria, Greece, Malta, Cyprus, Latvia, Luxembourg, Belgium, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Germany and Finland, all of whom said yes. I had read the Constitution. I knew that when the referendum came I should vote against it because it was too bureaucratic and therefore I thought likely to be inhumane. But when it went to France and the Netherlands, of course, they said no, and so referenda were cancelled in the Czech Republic, Denmark, Ireland, Poland, Portugal, Sweden and, yes, the United Kingdom. But what did they do, Madam Deputy Speaker? The European Union and those who govern it didn't change course and say, it turns out we can't get this system through the democratic consent of the peoples of Europe, so we must take another course. That's not what they did. As anyone who read Open Europe's side-by-side comparison of the Lisbon Treaty, which replaced the European Constitution next to that Constitution, anyone who read that document will know they're functionally equivalent. And what they did was an absolute democratic outrage. They changed the Constitution of France to avoid a referendum and they made Ireland vote twice. And that is why I'm in politics. The fundamental issue at stake today, Madam Deputy Speaker... I will, just before I finish.
I get the impression that he's on his peroration. I can't resist an historic footnote to the Lisbon Treaty, and that is that when a number of us argued that we ought to have a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty in the United Kingdom, one party said that we shouldn't have a referendum on this, we should have an in-out referendum on our membership of the European Union, and that party was the Liberal Democrats. Where are they on that position today?
Well, of course, as he knows, they're now committed to always ignoring a Leave result, and that too is an outrage, but at least they're clear about it, and I feel confident we could rely on them to abide by it. The fundamental point is this, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people must get the government they vote for, and they must not get the government that they didn't vote for, that they can't get rid of. This is a fundamental point related to the dreams we all have of a better society. It's about the dignity of the individual and the right of every person to determine their future peacefully at the ballot box.
I'm just thinking, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the worst thing that the Irish could say of the European Union is that they made them vote twice, I can imagine there are a lot worse things to say about their relationship and their union with England. But anyway, this week, Madam Deputy Speaker, we had a sterling reminder from the United Kingdom Supreme Court that in the UK we live in a constitutional democracy with checks and balances on executive power. And we were also reminded, Madam Deputy Speaker, that for so long as Scotland remains part of this union, Scots law and the Scottish judiciary are deserving of respect. Because let us not forget that the 11 UK Supreme Court justices followed the unanimous decision of the 3 judges in Scotland's highest court, the Inner House of the Court of Session. And in Scotland, our democratic constitutional tradition goes back to the declaration of Arbroath in 1320, which we'll be celebrating 700 years of next year, and the Claim of Right in 1689. And the principle of those documents is that neither the sovereign nor the government is above the law. And it was very refreshing to hear Lady Hale remind us that the same has been the position in England since at least 1611, when she said in her statement on Tuesday that as long ago as 1611, the court in England held that the king, who was then the government, hath no prerogative but that which the law of the land allows him. So constitutional democracy means not a tyranny by the executive, but parliamentary democracy with checks and balances. And as Lord Drummond-Young said in Scotland's highest court, the courts cannot subject the actings of the executive to political scrutiny, but they can and should ensure that the body charged with performing the task of political scrutiny, that is Parliament, is able to do so. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't think anyone on the benches behind me will take any lectures from the Conservative and Unionist Party about the importance of democracy when it was their leader who tried to shut down parliamentary democracy for 5 weeks at a time of constitutional crisis in the UK. And of course, what Lady Hale stressed was that there are two... Well, I'm very happy to take an intervention if the learned gentleman wants to make one.
Right, offer me the chance to intervene. The point